Hello, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Connor Wakeman. I am the Assistant Director of Research Integrity at the University of Texas at Dallas. And today we're going to discuss practices for engaging in international research collaborations. In terms of our learning objectives, I'm going to go over two sets of regulations that are applicable to international research collaborations. We're going to go over some examples of relationships and activities that may trigger compliance with those regulations, and then we're going to discuss key considerations, so questions that researchers should ask in terms of, how am I designing, how am I going to conduct, and how do I intend to report the results of this international research collaboration that may require some kind of compliance or create some kind of risk for compliance with, with federal regulations or with the requirements of federal funding agencies. And then I'm going to go through some practices, some general practices, and discuss, an example of how those practices can reduce the risk that a researcher faces, when engaging in international research collaboration. So in terms of the two regulations that we're going to cover, we're going to talk about U.S. export control law, and we're going to talk about conflict of commitment as it applies to research that is funded by the U.S. federal government. So whenever I talk about U.S. export controls, as a brief refresher, we're talking about regulations that require compliance whenever you're exporting or providing access to technical data, technology, software, or hardware that has some kind of foreign policy, national security, or trade protection control that is expressed through either the Commerce Control List, the U.S. Munitions List, or the Office of Foreign Asset Controls. And so in terms of, when these things become applicable to research collaborations, we're talking about whenever the design of a research project includes technology or equipment or information that has some kind of military or dual-use application, or whenever the research project itself is likely to result in some kind of actual physical item or some kind of technology that would have a military or dual-use application. And then we're also export controls can also apply whenever you're looking at how you're reporting the results of the work, because in terms of, as we'll talk about a little bit later, the fundamental research exclusion, only protects research done at U.S. academic institutions whenever the project results are going to be openly reported. And so, before you head into a research collaboration, that you don't intend to share the results of the work, then export controls can apply to the actual research project itself. And then in terms of the design of the project, export controls can also become an issue whenever you are looking at dealing with entities or individuals who are sanctioned or embargoed by the U.S. federal government. So we'll talk a little bit more about that right now. So in terms of sanctioned entities, what I mean by that is a person or an entity, or in some cases a country that is subject to certain rules or restrictions related to U.S. national and economic security that are imposed by the U.S. federal government. And so those relationships, whenever whenever a person or an entity that is sanctioned by the U.S. government is involved or party to a research collaboration, that automatically creates export control risk because working with those individuals or those entities requires specific authorization from the U.S. government that goes above and beyond the normal consideration of the normal consideration of the Commerce Control List or the U.S. Munitions List in terms of, am I going to be sending them some kind of military article, defense article, or some kind of dual-use article? And so, these kinds of relationships, because of the heightened risk to the institution and to, the individual researcher, require additional disclosure and scrutiny between the researcher and UTD and also likely some kind license authorization or some kind of disclosure to the relevant federal agency, particularly if federally funded research is involved. And so in terms of continuing the discussion of how these regulations affect the conduct of the research, so conflict of commitment can become a concern for a international research collaboration whenever you are engaged in federally funded research, because in this case, the conflict of commitment is a situation where there is some kind of activity or relationship that an individual researcher has that interferes with their ability either to perform a project or to meet their obligations to UTD and the funding agency that is paying for the research that they're working on. And the concern with conflict of commitment is right now is focused on research or scientific misconduct that typically involves either failing to report research results or failing to report intellectual property or sharing intellectual property that was intended to result from the project, in a way that devalues or takes away the commercial value of it. It also, conflict of commitment can arise in terms of managing access to research data and sharing pre-publication research data outside of the project personnel or, with, or sharing it in a way that reduces the investment that the U.S. federal government has made in that research project. And so some real-world conflict of commitment examples would be, for instance, if a principal investigator at UTD was funded by, say, the National Institutes of Health, and they also received funding from a separate research or from an outside entity from a foreign government to investigate a similar or an overlapping topic. And so now you have one investigator who's received funding from two sources to investigate a similar topic, and so there are overlapping competing interests in that case. The second example is similar in that if a federally funded researcher engages with a collaborator at another institution, and that collaborator meets the definition to qualify as a foreign component, which is something that the National Institutes of Health specifically defines. And so foreign component is when key aspects of a research effort are performed at another academic institution outside of the United States. And so, in that case, it may not be, it may be that our PI, who has the responsibilities to the NIH, along with UTD, it may be that they have an appointment there at this institution that, it facilitates the research that occurs at this foreign academic institution that relates or overlaps with contributes to the NIH-funded project. And so, again, that relationship creates a competing interest that needs to be declared, reported to the funding agency to make sure that it is not interfering with your obligations to the funding agency. Another, example of that is a similar situation where, you have a principal investigator who hosts a visiting scholar from, another country, and, that visiting scholar participates in federally funded research, has access to the data from the federally funded research project, and, if that person wasn't originally part of the, like the project plan, but they are making contributions to the project in a way where they would be considered a co-author. The NIH, our obligations to the NIH, even though that person is not our employee, need to be conveyed to that visiting scholar. And so some of the same risks that federal funding agencies see in terms of a heightened risk for scientific misconduct, for transfer of intellectual property, for unauthorized sharing of research data can occur sort of inside the institution whenever a visiting scholar is involved, as whenever, a foreign component is contributing significantly to a federally funded research effort. So, conflict commitment becomes a concern in terms of just being transparent in how you go about, how you conduct this research effort that the funding agency is supporting at the institution. So now that we've kind of laid the groundwork and identified, the regulatory environments in which, these research collaborations exist, we're going to go through, identify types of collaborations that we normally see at an academic institution, some key questions that researchers need to ask themselves before you engage in the collaboration that relates to these regulations, and then walk through an example. So in terms of the types of collaborations that, may need to comply with, conflict of commitment and export control regulations, I've organized the collaborations here in terms of, most formal to least formal. So if you have a subcontract with a foreign entity, or you're paying someone, you're hiring them as consultants, there's an agreement between the university, there's a transfer of funds between UTD and that, and this entity or this person. And so, if that agreement comes through the research office, we will go through and help you identify all of the risks for both conflict of commitment and export control compliance. And so the same thing with an institutional partnership. If you want to have an institution level partnership with a foreign entity, there is a specific committee, the International Education Development Committee at UTD, that reviews all of those agreements and makes sure that they're contributing to the academic and research mission of the university. And so, in terms of those kinds of collaborations, the university is involved and has oversight and will assist in identifying the risks, to the institution and to the individual researcher from those kinds of relationships. The next three, when you're getting into a foreign component, when you're getting into you as a researcher receiving a grant or support from a foreign institution that doesn't necessarily go through the university, or you receive an academic appointment at another institution, that in that case, there may not be a formal agreement between the university and this other institution. And so it would be up to the researcher to come to be aware of, the risks that, I'm going to talk about in a little bit, and to come to the research office or, the department and ask, hey, is there anything that I need to be aware of? Ask these kinds of questions about export control, conflict of commitment risk, before engaging in this collaboration. And then in terms of, hosting a visiting scholar or engaging in a consulting activity or informal collaboration, these are the least formal types of research collaborations. But despite that, there are still, risks for conflict of commitment and export control compliance, insofar as, you could still be working on a project that has a military or dual use application, or you could still be working with an entity or an individual who is sanctioned or affiliated with a sanctioned institution. And so, asking these kinds of questions, at the outset is still important, even though, there may not be a formal agreement that relates to, the collaboration. So the key, considerations that I would recommend researchers ask, before engaging in an international collaboration is, who am I working with? Is there anyone do I see any red flags in terms of the, the entities that, or the organizations that they're employed by, or that they work with, or that they're funded by? Make sure that, in terms of, if you're going to be sharing research data and, you may not be asking that they keep it confidential, but hey, let's not share the data before we're ready to, ready to publish together. If it's that kind of that's the intention of the collaboration, just be aware of who will have access to that data, after you transfer it to, this other collaboration, or you generate it, or if you're generating data outside of the United States at another academic institution, who would have access to this data? Who are all the people that are involved in this research effort? Think about what is the scope of the collaboration. This ties back to the export control related risks in terms of, is there some kind of military or dual commercial military application for the work that I will be doing? Is it likely that the work will generate some kind of invention or some kind of intellectual property that would be valuable? Are we using proprietary or pre-existing proprietary information or confidential information in the work that may affect our ability to report the results of the collaboration? Which ties into the next question of, what am I going to do with the results of the collaboration in order to claim the fundamental research exclusion and protect myself as a researcher from the export control compliance? I need to be publishing the results of the work that I do, particularly whenever I'm doing it outside of the United States. And so in terms of I need to be aware of, are there any restrictions? Am I accepting any restrictions on my ability to publish the results of the work? If I am going to be, if proprietary information or if I want to control access to the data before I'm ready to publish it, that needs to be outlined and identified up front. Also, does this collaboration, if it's not through any kind of contractual agreement, does it overlap with my funded research at UTD? Is there the possibility that the collaboration would involve a conflict of commitment because, I have a relationship, I have an appointment at another institution, or another institution is, researchers at another institution are contributing significantly to this research project, this research collaboration that overlaps with federally funded research, and making sure that I have reported and disclosed, that the role of this other institution and the interests of this other institution in the, to the federal funding agency. So the example that I want to use is actually I would say the least complicated example of a research collaboration, because I think it still shows that even at this informal level, there are still risks for export control and conflict of commitment compliance. And so, this is loosely based on a faculty member that came to me with some questions, and we discussed basically these exact considerations. So it was a UTD faculty member and a faculty member at an academic institution in France, and they had been working on a similar mathematical principle, and so they sort of independently were working towards the same conclusion, and it was a scientific, sort of a fundamental research project. It wasn't anything with a commercial value, and they, having discovered that there was this overlap, and rather than publishing competing journal articles, they decided, hey, let's collaborate and we'll publish this article together. And so there's going to be data, limited data that will be shared, particularly, and the results will be shared between UTD and the collaborating institution. The work at UTD, was funded by the National Science Foundation, but the UTD researcher doesn't have an appointment at the collaborating institution. And this seems like a fairly straightforward example. They're given the intention of the collaboration is to, publish a journal article, and they're, it's the result of fundamental research. There doesn't really need to be an agreement that, that relates to this. And so, but on the other hand, as you'll see in a little bit, there are still risks related to export control, compliance, and conflict of commitment, even whenever you're talking about kind of an informal collaboration like this. So before we get into the example, we're going to talk through some recommended practices. So I've highlighted just some very philosophical ideas of, engage in fundamental research, meet your reporting obligations to your federal funding agencies, and control access to, data information, controlled data and information. So information and data that's not intended for, public consumption, or at least not ready for public consumption. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through, some more specifics for what each of these ideas mean. But, if as a researcher you pay attention to these three things, you will, you can protect yourself from and meet your obligations in terms of export control compliance and conflict of commitment, without, you can reduce your risk in these areas significantly. So in terms of engaging in fundamental research, what do I mean whenever I say that? It seems like a simple idea, but it requires a little bit of unpacking. So the fundamental research exclusion is part of the export control regulations, and so the gist of it is that if academics if researchers engaging in basic and applied research in science, engineering, and mathematics at academic institutions are engaging in research where they're going to share the results, and there are no restrictions for proprietary or national security reasons on their ability to disseminate the results of their work, then the information software that results from that work is not subject to U.S. export control regulation. And so, this protects U.S. universities from having to review the results of every single, research project, at least the information and software that results, for whether, something for U.S. export control compliance. One thing I will add is that commodities and materials that result from those projects are still subject to U.S. export control compliance. So while we can share the information and software that results from the project, if as part of that project you also, say, create a prototype of integrated circuit, that commodity, that physical thing would still require an export control determination and potentially a license to send that thing outside of the United States. And if you take the next effort of, you've designed, say, an integrated circuit, and you want to then fabricate it, now that design file is potentially also subject to U.S. export control regulations. So whenever you are, and that was why previously I was mentioning about, okay, what is it that I'm intending to create in the course of this project? If it's going to be information and software where you are, generating, you're engaging in experimental science and you are attempting to, produce data and you're going to share that generally, and there's a public good that comes out of this research project, then, that is clearly in the realm of, fundamental research. Whenever you get into, research that has more of a proprietary application where you are creating products, or creating prototypes where there's a specific application, or more of a specific end user, in mind in terms of the results of the work itself, then you are moving away from fundamental research, and you need to be more concerned with, whether the thing that you're creating in the course of this project may require export control compliance. And so, this is when I'll add, in terms of traveling overseas as a researcher and engaging in discussions and experiments with other academics, you are, more likely to be engaged in fundamental research than if a company asks you to be a consultant for them, travel overseas and meet with them. And so, in terms of the outcome of those kinds of conversations, those conversations you're not intending to, as a consultant, to, to publish and disseminate the work that you've done for that company. And so, in terms of the difference between, collaborating with an academic and serving as a consultant for a commercial entity, the export control compliance is fundamentally different. And so, it's the same thing in terms of, being considerate of what is the scope of the work that you're going to be engaging in as part of this research collaboration. Is it something where it is information that you will publish and share, or is it likely that there will be inventions, there will be proprietary information that will result that you will want to withhold from publication. And so then once you reach that level, then you would need to, if this is something that relates to your university research, your funded research at UTD, come to the research, please contact the research office and we can talk to you about, hey, is this something that has a potential military or dual use, or, is this an invention, something that the university would want to protect and, file a patent on, and we can make sure and help you to make sure that, even though going in, you would, set up the research project properly, you didn't accept any restrictions on your ability to publish or anything like that, it eventually led to, some kind of, technology or invention, something that, would have some kind of, commercial value. And so, then the research office can help you to make sure to manage these obligations and identify if there is risks going forward in terms of, working on that technology with researchers outside of the United States. The second general category of, protecting yourself in terms of conflict of commitment is, to fulfill your reporting obligations to UTD and to your federal funding agencies. And so in this case, transparency really helps to remove the appearance of conflict of commitment, because you're transparent to UTD and to your funding agencies about who's involved, who's involved in the data collection and analysis, where you're collecting your data, and whether you have any relationships or other funded activities that overlap with this work that this federal funding agency is paying you to engage in. Then you can avoid the appearance that you have a conflicting obligation, and you can talk to the research office and make sure that if there is some kind of conflicting obligation, that it's either removed or mitigated, and we can help you to to continue that that collaboration that overlaps with the federal funding agency. But what the federal funding agencies right now are expecting of U.S. universities is that we are aware of the funded activities that our researchers are engaged in outside of the money that comes through, the funding that comes through this institution, and that researchers are reporting all of the support that they have, whether it's direct funding or if it's access to facilities that they're using to generate data that they will use as part of their to meet their obligations to the federal funding agencies. That's included in support documentation. That the positions that relate to that kind of support is included in biosketches, and that researchers are fully disclosing to the university, financial interests. So that would be, if you have a summer appointment, that's disclosed to university, and that the salary that you receive is disclosed to university, and and that we have discussed with you, hey, does this research that you're engaged in, at this other institution, while we don't normally think about that from a conflict of interest perspective, because we're normally thinking about conflict of interest in terms of a commercial entity, that concern is still there, but now, funding agencies are telling universities and researchers to make sure that we are being totally transparent with them about who all is working on the research that they are, that they're paying us to perform, and and who, including who we're sharing, we're sharing our data with, before we're ready to publish it and before it gets reported to, the funding agency. So in terms of meeting these obligations, we've put multiple. The Office of Research has added pages about summary of reporting responsibilities from COI, invention disclosures, export controls, in terms of support documentation. And we also have our conflict of interest review system, where, if you have a outside activity that you need to disclose to the institution and get approval under our outside activity policy, you can do that through that activity and interest report form. So the third way that you can protect yourself from the appearance of conflict of commitment and export control compliance is in terms of if there is existing proprietary information, confidential information that you have access to through university employment, and to essentially, only share it when absolutely necessary, and share it under an agreement with this other institution. So in terms of confidential information, so that would be like, grant information or information about grants that you have access to, through your university employment, or technical information that you have access to because a company or another institution shared that information with us. But it's relevant to the research that you are performing for the funding agency. And so if your collaboration requires that you share those kinds of information with someone else, with this collaborator or their institution, the best practice would be to contact the research office and ask, hey, I need to share this information as part of this research collaboration. Do we need a confidentiality agreement to share that information? When you're getting down into research data, so the results, data collected in the course of fundamental research is considered controlled data, and so it isn't necessarily confidential. And so in terms of who gets to decide how and when you share that, as the principal investigator for a research effort, you would be for a federally funded research project, you would be considered the data custodian. And so what we would recommend is, if there is a research collaboration that you are engaged in that overlaps with your federally funded research project, that you have a data management plan that articulates, who you're sharing that data with, what the project is, who you're sharing the data with, how you're going to share it, what it is that you're actually going to be sharing, the intention to publish that information. And so just to make sure that you have a record of, the normal, of your expectations of how this collaboration is going to contribute to the federally funded project. If it's in the grant, if it's part of the grant, great. That's even better, because then that's, that is clear and that's transparent to the funding agency, that this is who all is going to be contributing to this project, and they probably already required some kind of data sharing plan. And so if that doesn't already exist, or if the relationship was not originally part of, the funding proposal, we recommend, putting a data management plan in place that articulates, how you're going to collaborate, and then reporting, that, and that can be part of, your reporting to the federal funding agency in terms of, hey, I started this collaboration, it overlaps with my funded project. And so we can meet their expectations of transparency and show that we're taking care of, we're being good data custodians of the information that they're asking us to collect, the research investigation they're asking us to perform. The other side of that is, I was talking earlier about that, if the project seems like it's heading to the point of there would be some kind of technology, especially an invention that might result from the project, something with some kind of commercial value. In terms of meeting your obligations in that area, make sure you're reporting inventions to the Technology Commercialization Office. They have a specific process for going through that with you and giving you advice on, hey, this is something that's patentable or not, and talking to you about publishing and all of that. And then in terms of, if you have questions on the data management side, we have a research data management team who can help you in terms of setting up data management plans, asking you questions, particularly on your information security controls, and how you can securely share pre-publication research data with other collaborators from other institutions. So, in terms of walking through then our example from, our informal collaboration, now we have, these practices in terms of fundamental research, fulfilling our reporting obligations to our federal funding agencies, and controlling access to confidential proprietary information. So if in the course of, that informal collaboration, you run into one of these sort of, I want to call them red flags. So say a collaborator tells you, yes, I would love to collaborate with you, but, while your work is funded by the National Science Foundation, my work is funded by, a sanctioned entity. Or, hey, I'm also, collaborating on this project with employees from a sanctioned entity. And so, by extension, you would be affiliated with this entity that, requires additional scrutiny for you as a U.S. researcher to work with them. And so that would be something where I would recommend coming to, me as the export control office and, saying, hey, I'm potentially doing research that is related to this sanctioned entity. Is there any risk here for export control compliance? And I can help you kind of walk through the steps of, is there anything that, would be risky to you or to the university? Other things would be like requests from your collaborator or from the collaborating institution to take on obligations that would either create a conflict of commitment or would violate the fundamental research exclusion. So if in the course of the project they say, hey, we've been doing this, it's been fundamental research, but now we want to withhold the results from publication. So, whenever you, it could be as informal as that. It doesn't have to be, articulated in the agreement. And so, if that changes, if your understanding was at the beginning, hey, we're going to publish, but then they change their mind, now that change would potentially remove the fundamental research exclusion from this project, because now, the results of the one party doesn't intend to publish the results of the effort. Another request would be if the scope of the project changes in the course of the project in a way that at the outset, hey, you didn't design it to have a specific military or dual use application, but if it changes direction and goes that way, or if, at the beginning of the project, there wasn't any requests from your collaborator to have access to proprietary or confidential information from UTD, but in the course of the project that changes, that would definitely be a red flag to come to the research office and say, hey, or to make sure, it may not be that in and of itself is a problem, but, to make sure you have an agreement and you're sharing that information appropriately. Another red flag would be if they ask you, if you say, okay, yes, we can collaborate related to my federally funded research, but I have, I have to report, this collaboration. I'm going to include you in my progress reports. That's not a request for approval or anything. It's just, a normal part of your reporting obligations to the federal funding agency. They ask you not to do that. That would definitely be a red flag that, there is something else that's going on, and you honoring that request could potentially be a conflict of commitment. And so, any one of these things that, could potentially pop up in the course of even an informal research collaboration could create export control or conflict of commitment risk. And so, if you get into a more complicated scenario where some of these things may actually occur in terms of a foreign component or accepting an appointment at another institution, then, there is that higher risk for compliance with those regulations, because that is an aspect of the research collaboration. So in terms of the lessons that I would hope researchers can take away from this presentation would be to understand when your research may not qualify for the fundamental research exclusion. If you come through the research office, for funded projects, that is a regular part of our process. Particularly if you're working in a technology area or with a funding agency, who regularly funds work that is restricted. And so if you are one of those researchers who has a lot of Department of Defense or Department of Energy funding, you are at higher risk that your, collaborations may also not qualify for the fundamental research exclusion. But also just understanding the the aspect of designing your project from the outset to intend to publish. That is probably the most important thing that can protect you from export control compliance. Fully disclose your research support positions and relationships to UTD and the funding agencies. So just practice transparency from the outset. It shouldn't really be a question of whether you disclose or not. It's just what the funding agencies want is that we are an open book when it comes to who is involved in our project and where the research is being done. And, to please come to the Office of Research before engaging in collaborations that do overlap with your funded research. And so we can help you to manage these obligations because we exist to provide you with advice and to help make sure that, you're presenting the information about your project and you are identifying, who all is involved in a way that is clear to the funding agency. And so, it doesn't appear like, you're trying to not be transparent with them. And so that is the end of my presentation. I have some additional documents here in terms of a guide for international collaboration and relationships that walks through examples like this. If you're considering doing X, Y, or Z, contact the research office and fill out this form or ask this question, and then it articulates what the research office, who the research office can help and what we will likely do. I've also included some links to pages from the Office of Research webpage in terms of intellectual property being the inventor's guide, in terms of export control concerns for researchers, and then your responsibilities to disclose conflicts of interest and commitment to not only the university, but to federal funding agencies. And so, these are all publicly available. And if you are interested in other, documentation about how to identify, I have, for instance, the guidelines about, is my collaboration a component? Is it a subcontract? Is it a visiting scholar? Is it a collaboration? And then what are my obligations now that I've understood what my collaboration actually looks like? What is the form of it? And just, we're available to answer any questions that you may have. And so thank you for your time. And those of you who are, listening, please feel free to type questions into the chat feature, and I can answer them. Well, it doesn't look like there are any questions. So if there are no questions, thank you for attending this webinar, and have a nice afternoon.